This story will help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and let's drift into peaceful dreams. The wind howled through the empty streets, a chilling reminder of the storm raging outside. Inside the abandoned warehouse, the flicker of a single light cast long shadows that danced like specters against the cracked concrete walls. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was oppressive, unnatural, as though the very building held its breath. Eli adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, eyes flicking nervously to the corners of the room. "It's too quiet," he muttered, his voice barely louder than the whisper of the wind. Maya, moving with practiced ease, knelt by a set of old metal crates stacked in the corner. "You're imagining things. This place has been empty for years. Nobody's here." But Eli wasn't convinced. There was something wrong, something off about the way the shadows twisted in the dim light. His pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "I don't know, something feels." The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the room, sharp and deliberate. Neither of them moved, too still in their disbelief. Then the noise stopped. Eli's heart hammered in his chest, his eyes darting to Maya. She met his gaze, her brow furrowed, but her lips tight in that way that told him she was just as unsettled. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady but lacking conviction. The only answer was the rustle of something shifting, something large, something deliberate. Then, just as quickly as the footsteps had appeared, the room fell silent once more. Too silent. Eli's breath caught in his throat. "Maya, something's wrong." His voice cracked, betraying the fear creeping up his spine. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the dim corners, looking for any sign of movement. The shadows were too deep, too still. He could feel them closing in on him. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway at the far end of the warehouse, standing motionless. It was too dark to see clearly, but Eli could make out the outline of someone tall, unmoving, watching. His stomach dropped. Eli's voice trembled. "Maya, don't." But before he could finish, Maya whipped around, pulling out a small flashlight. She turned it towards the doorway. The beam cut through the dark like a knife. There was nothing there, nothing but the vacant, empty space. "What the hell?" Eli whispered, taking a step back. "Get a grip," Maya snapped, trying to mask her own unease with bravado. But her eyes flickered toward the door, the glint of uncertainty unmistakable. A sudden, deafening crash sounded from behind them, a metal clang that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the building. They both spun around, hearts pounding in their throats. Nothing, just the distant echo of their racing breaths. The air felt heavier now, as if someone was closing in around them, moving just out of sight. The silence between them was thick, pregnant with unspoken fear. "Eli," Maya said, her voice a sharp whisper now. "I don't like this. We need to leave. Now." But Eli, eyes locked on the now empty doorway, couldn't tear himself away. He felt it then, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, of being hunted. And then a whisper, so faint he almost couldn't catch it. "You're not alone." His breath hitched. Eli's pulse raced, his mind struggling to make sense of the voice he had just heard. It hadn't come from Maya. She was still beside him, frozen, her eyes wide with terror as they both scanned the empty room. The whisper seemed to echo in his skull, a low, chilling presence that crept under his skin. "You heard that too, right?" Eli breathed, barely able to get the words out. Maya nodded, but there was something strange in her expression now, a flicker of doubt. Her usual confidence had cracked, and Eli could see her calculating, like she was trying to convince herself that everything had a rational explanation. She reached for her phone, fingers shaking as she tapped the screen. "I'm calling for backup. We can't be alone in here. There's got to be someone else." A loud bang shattered the quiet, louder than before, this time from above. It was followed by a muffled scraping sound, like something heavy dragging across the rooftop. Both of them froze, eyes wide, ears straining for any further sign of movement. Maya lowered her phone, face pale. "That's not right. That doesn't make sense." Eli took a cautious step forward, his mind racing. We need to find out where it's coming from. Without waiting for her response, he moved toward a staircase that led up to the second level, the metal steps creaking under his weight. Maya hesitated but followed him, her footsteps almost too quiet in the thick silence. As they reached the top, the scraping sound stopped abruptly. The quiet that followed was suffocating, the absence of noise even more unnerving than the sounds they had just heard. Eli's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating stacks of old crates and rusted machinery, but nothing more. It was clear now that whoever, or whatever, had been following them was no longer in plain sight, but the feeling of being watched remained, a weight pressing down on their chests. Then something caught Eli's eye. On the far wall, behind a curtain of dust, was a large, faded painting, a portrait of a man. His features were obscured by years of neglect, but the eyes were unmistakable. They seemed to follow him, no matter where he stood. "Maya, look at this," Eli said, his voice trembling despite his attempts to keep calm. Maya walked over and squinted at the painting. "What is it?" "The eyes," Eli whispered. "They're moving." Maya's lips parted in disbelief. "Eli, you're losing it." But just then, the scraping sound returned, louder this time, from directly beneath them. It was as if something was clawing at the walls, the sound growing nearer and nearer with each passing second. Maya grabbed his arm, her grip iron tight. "Eli, we have to go. Now." But it was already too late. From the shadows of the far corner, a figure emerged, tall and thin, draped in dark clothing. It moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, like it was gliding rather than walking. Eli froze, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the figure could hear it. The stranger didn't speak, but the air around them seemed to crackle with an unspoken threat. It wasn't just the figure that unnerved Eli. It was the feeling that came with it, a suffocating sense of something ancient and powerful watching them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the breath in his lungs turning to ice. "Who are you?" Maya's voice was a low hiss, her hand still clutching Eli's sleeve. The figure remained silent, unmoving, but then it tilted its head, as if studying them with curiosity. The tension between them grew, thickening with each passing second. Without warning, the figure took a step forward, its footfall soft but deliberate. Then another step, and another. Eli and Maya took a step back in unison, their eyes locked on the approaching figure. The distance between them shrank, the air growing heavier with each movement. It wasn't until the figure was only a few feet away that it finally spoke, its voice a whisper that felt like it was coming from the depths of the earth. "You're not supposed to be here." Maya stumbled back, but Eli couldn't look away. "What do you want from us?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, its gaze moved to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to shift in unnatural patterns, as if they were alive. Eli's stomach churned. He didn't need to ask what was in that corner. He could already feel it, the presence, the weight of something ancient and malevolent, something far worse than the figure before them. Before he could warn Maya, the figure stepped back, its form blurring into the shadows, as though it had never been there at all. Maya was shaking now, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What the hell is happening?" "I don't know," Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes darted to the corner, where the shadows had begun to move in slow, deliberate waves. Something was coming, and it was coming for them. Eli's heart was racing, every instinct screaming for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows in the corner thickening, swirling, as if they were alive, pulling everything in. Maya's voice trembled, barely a whisper. "Eli, what do we do? What is that thing?" "I don't know," he muttered, his mind spinning, trying to find any way out of this nightmare. "But we have to keep moving. Whatever that thing is, it's not alone." He took a step back, pulling Maya with him. They had to get away from that corner. The air around it was thick with dread, like something inhuman was about to claw its way out. But as they moved, the lights above them flickered, the room trembling under an unseen force. The hum of electricity warped, distorting like a broken radio, until it was a shrill, almost painful noise. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed the warehouse. No moonlight, no faint glow from the city beyond, just pure blackness. Eli's breath hitched, his pulse pounding in his ears as he gripped Maya's arm, feeling her trembling in the void. "Stay close," he whispered. His voice felt impossibly loud in the silence. "Eli, Maya's voice cracked, and before she could finish, a soft scuffling sound echoed through the room, coming from the shadows. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. They weren't alone anymore. Something was moving in the dark, circling them. "Who's there?" Eli called out, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The words felt like a challenge, a plea. No response. The scuffling stopped. Silence again, but it wasn't the same silence. It was thick, pregnant with tension, suffocating. The kind of silence where you could feel eyes on you, where every breath seemed too loud. Then a whisper, so faint it sent a chill down Eli's spine. "Leave." The word slithered through the darkness, curling around them like smoke. Eli froze, eyes wide, his mind reeling. His body screamed at him to run, but he stood rooted to the spot, terror paralyzing him. Maya's grip on his arm tightened. "Eli, what was that? Who's here?" "I don't know," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "But we need to get out. Now." He took a step forward, his foot scraping against the floor, the noise unnervingly loud in the silence. Then another, the sound of soft breathing, just behind them, made his blood run cold. Maya's hand shot out, pulling him toward her, her nails digging into his arm. "Eli, I felt it. Something's right behind us." Eli spun around, his flashlight flicking back on, the beam cutting through the thick shadows. His breath caught in his throat. The figure from before was standing there again, just a few feet away. But this time, its face was clearer, its features twisted and sharp, like a mask carved from bone. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a thing of flesh, but wrong. Something distorted, not quite human. It didn't move. "Go," Maya gasped, eyes wide with terror. "Go now." But Eli couldn't move. His body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, eyes locked on the figure that stood motionless in front of them. Something in the air had changed. The room felt alive, pulsing with an energy he couldn't understand. And then the figure spoke again. "You cannot leave." The voice wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, hollow, as if it came from somewhere far beyond the room, far beyond the world. The shadows in the corner of the room began to stretch, slowly crawling toward them, thickening like a storm cloud. The temperature dropped even further, and Eli could see his breath in the cold, misting in front of his face. "Eli, we need to run." Maya's voice was almost frantic now, a raw edge to her words. "We can't stay here." He forced himself to look away from the figure. We're trapped." The walls felt closer now, as if the building itself was closing in on them. The air pressed against their skin, suffocating. The scuffling sound started again, but this time it was louder, more frantic. From the dark, shapes began to emerge, twisting in and out of the shadows. Indistinct, but there, a silent army waiting for the signal to attack. Then the figure in front of them moved, slowly, deliberately. It stepped toward them, its feet dragging across the floor, the air distorting as it came closer. It wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. It knew they couldn't escape. Eli's legs felt like they were filled with lead, his mind racing. "Maya, we have to do something. We can't let it." Before he could finish, the floor beneath them rumbled, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The walls around them cracked, and the shadows grew thicker, more solid, pulling at the edges of the room like an unstoppable force. Maya's face was pale, her eyes wild. "Eli, no more running. We stand or we die." Together, for the first time since they'd entered the warehouse, Eli saw something in her eyes, something more than fear, determination. Together, he agreed, his voice steadier than he felt. They didn't have a choice. The figure stopped, standing just feet away. The shadows around them seemed to hold their breath. The moment stretched, taut and waiting. And then, as if on cue, the figure spoke once more, its voice a whisper like the wind. "You have chosen poorly." And then everything went black. The darkness wasn't just black. It was suffocating, pressing down on them from all sides, like it wanted to consume them whole. Eli could feel the weight of it in his chest, the air thick and stagnant, as if the room had forgotten how to breathe. His heart pounded so loudly, he was sure the figure would hear it, sure the shadows could sense the fear pouring off of him. He reached out, his hand trembling, but found nothing, just the cold emptiness of the room. The flashlight had gone out in the blackout, leaving them helpless in the dark. Only the faintest scrape of air against his skin told him they weren't alone. He could still feel the presence, that terrible, overwhelming sensation of something or someone watching, waiting. Maya's voice, shaky and near panic, broke the silence. Eli were not alone. They're closing in. Her words echoed around him, but the darkness swallowed them up before they could go anywhere. The room felt infinite now, like it stretched beyond reason, beyond space. The air was raw, too thick, too cold, clinging to their skin like something alive. Eli's mind raced, desperately trying to latch onto anything familiar, anything that might give him a way out. But every time he tried to focus, the shadows seemed to shift, moving just out of the reach of his senses. They were like liquid, oozing, crawling, stretching, and the closer they came, the more the room felt like it was tilting, like it was folding in on itself. Then the whisper came again. "Leave." It was softer this time, almost gentle, but the command behind it was unmistakable. It was as though the words came from everywhere, from the walls, from the air itself. Eli stiffened, the hair on his neck rising. He swallowed hard, but it felt like the air had thickened, like it was getting harder to breathe. "What do you want from us?" Maya demanded, her voice wavering but desperate. She was gripping Eli's arm so tightly. He could feel the sharpness of her nails digging into his skin, and it gave him some small, fleeting sense of control amidst the chaos. The figure's voice answered, a rasping breath in the thick darkness. "You cannot leave." The sound of a sharp intake of breath echoed from the corner of the room. For a moment, it felt like everything had gone still, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then, something shifted in the dark, a faint, twisting sound, like something massive uncoiling. Eli's blood ran cold. In the corner, where the shadows had been still, something moved, fast, unnatural. The darkness seemed to contort, morphing into something more solid, something with substance. It took form in the space between Eli and Maya. A figure, tall and thin, emerging from the blackness, its outline jagged, like it was composed of pieces stitched together from the void itself. Maya's breath hitched. "Eli! Eli!" She tried to take a step back, but her legs buckled beneath her, panic taking over. Eli caught her, but his gaze was fixed on the shape in the corner, the thing that wasn't supposed to be there. It was looming, a twisted silhouette that hovered just on the edge of the shadows, waiting. The thing didn't move. It was watching, but there was something worse about it now. Something darker. Without warning, the figure shifted closer, its form melting into the darkness, and the air turned frigid, a sharp, biting cold that stole the breath from their lungs. The shadows thickened again, pressing in tighter, suffocatingly so. It felt like the room was shrinking with each passing second. The space between them and the figure stretched further, but that distance was growing meaningless. The walls seemed to be pulling them toward it, drawn by an invisible force. A cold, raspy laugh echoed in the darkness. "Leave now." It wasn't the figure's voice, but something darker, more primal. The words twisted through the air, more like an order, a command, and with it came an almost tangible weight, as if the very room itself was pushing them closer to whatever lay in the dark. Maya gasped, her grip tightening on Eli's sleeve, but he could feel her shaking, her body trembling as though it might shatter at any moment. "What is that? What is it doing?" "I don't know." Eli managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. The hairs on his arm stood on end, his skin crawling with a mix of fear and disbelief. "But we need to get out of here." He started to pull her toward the doorway, his eyes never leaving the dark shape that had materialized in the corner. But with every step he took, the room seemed to bend and shift, as if the very layout of the place was changing. It was harder to move now. Every step was sluggish, like he was walking through thick mud. The air felt heavier, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to follow, pressing in closer, tighter, until they were wrapping around him like chains. Then, just as Eli thought they might break free, something grabbed him. Cold, clammy fingers that felt like ice around his wrist. Maya screamed, her voice cracking the thick silence. Eli tried to pull away, but the grip only tightened, pulling him back toward the center of the room. It wasn't a hand. It was more like tentacles, swirling out of the shadows, their unseen forms weaving through the air like living things. They constricted around his chest, choking the breath from his lungs. He tried to call out to Maya, but the words died in his throat. Panic surged, his heart racing, every muscle in his body screaming to escape. But the shadows tightened their grip. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Maya was right beside him, struggling, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. Eli, help me, please. And then everything went still. The darkness deepened, and the whisper returned, this time louder, sharper, as if it were coming from inside their heads. You cannot escape. The words echoed in Eli's mind, reverberating with a finality that made his blood run cold. The shadows twisted tighter, the invisible grip around his chest and limbs squeezing until it felt like his very bones were about to snap. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. It was like the darkness had become part of him, suffocating him from the inside out. His vision blurred, his head spinning as the pressure built, the shadows pulling him in deeper. Every instinct screamed for him to fight, to break free, but his body wouldn't obey. The cold, unnatural touch of the darkness seemed to seep into his skin, crawling beneath it, leaving a trail of frozen fire. Maya's desperate cries for him to move, to do something, barely reached his ears through the thick fog of panic enveloping him. She was fighting too, her frantic movements barely registering to him as the room seemed to warp around them. Then, a sudden flash of light. It was faint, flickering like a dying ember, but it cut through the blackness like a knife. For a moment, everything stopped. The grip around Eli's chest loosened just enough for him to gasp a desperate breath. His legs wobbled, barely holding him upright, but he didn't dare let go of Maya's hand. Eli, Maya whispered, her voice trembling. What's happening? What is this? Eli could barely respond. The flickering light grew brighter, pulsing now, as if it was drawing them toward something or someone. The shadows seemed to recoil, as though they were afraid of the light, pulling back just enough to give them room to move. Eli had no idea how long they had before it came back, but the oppressive feeling in the room was unbearable. With everything in him, he fought against the shadows, forcing himself to move, his limbs heavy but determined. He dragged Maya toward the light, but every step felt like he was walking through thick mud. Every inch of space seemed to stretch further away as the pressure of the room grew, like an unseen hand was pushing them back. Come on, Eli rasped, his voice barely more than a breath. We need to get to the light. But before they could make any more progress, the shadows surged forward again, faster than before. They were like living things, writhing, snapping, trying to reclaim their hold. A deafening roar filled the room, a sound so low and guttural it shook the very foundation beneath their feet. The walls groaned, the entire building creaking, as if it were on the verge of collapse. The shadows multiplied, coming from every corner of the room, swirling together, forming a dark mass of writhing tendrils that seemed to choke the life out of everything it touched. Maya screamed, her hand slipping from Eli's as she was yanked backward by a force so strong it sent her crashing to the ground. Eli, help! Eli's heart skipped a beat as he watched her struggle, her body twisting and jerking as the shadows pulled her back toward the center of the room. Her fingers clawed at the floor, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong. No, Eli shouted, his voice raw. Desperation surged through him. He had to save her. He couldn't let this thing take her, too. He lunged forward, his legs shaking, his body on the verge of collapse. But before he could reach her, a figure stepped between them. It wasn't human. It was taller than the figure he had seen earlier, more imposing. The shadows seemed to form around it, its body made from the very darkness that now swirled through the room. Its face, if it could be called that, was nothing more than an outline of shifting shadows, an emptiness that seemed to swallow all light. Its eyes glowed faintly, two small, cold spots in the vast, swirling blackness. "You cannot save her," the figure said, its voice a low, ominous whisper that echoed in Eli's mind. Eli froze, fear crawling through him, making his body tremble. He wanted to fight, wanted to scream, but the figure's presence paralyzed him. He couldn't move, couldn't even bring himself to look away. He felt like he was being pulled into the figure's gaze, like it was reaching into his soul. Maya's voice, panicked and pleading, broke through his daze. "Eli, don't listen to it. Please help me." The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was as if it was the darkness, a force too ancient and too powerful to fight. Eli's mind raced, his thoughts spinning, trying to come up with something, anything, that might stop it. But nothing made sense. The figure wasn't trying to kill them. It wasn't trying to hurt them, not directly. It was simply waiting. Waiting for what? Eli's gaze flickered to the shadows that continued to crawl along the walls, gathering like a storm. The room felt like it was collapsing in on them. The air was thick with tension, suffocating them with the weight of something ancient and unforgiving. "Why are you doing this?" Eli asked, his voice hoarse, barely able to break through the cold, heavy silence. The figure's hollow gaze seemed to burn into him. "Because you should not have come here. None of you should have come." Then, without warning, the shadows exploded, surging forward in a wave of darkness. Eli felt them crash into him, wrapping around him like chains, pulling him down. His body went limp, his head spinning as the air was squeezed from his lungs. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. Eli blinked, gasping for air, his body aching. He was still on the ground, his limbs heavy, but the shadows had receded. The room was still, eerily silent. Maya was gone. Panic surged through him, his heart pounding as he scrambled to his feet. "Maya! Maya, where are you?" The darkness hung in the air, thick with a sense of finality. The figure was gone, but the room still felt wrong, like the air was alive, waiting. And then, from somewhere in the distance, he heard it. A whisper. "You will never leave this place." Eli's blood ran cold at the sound of the whisper, that same voice that had been a constant presence in the room. He whipped his head around, his eyes frantic, searching the now silent shadows. "Maya!" His voice cracked as the word tore itself out of his throat, but there was no answer. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, pressing against his chest as though the room itself was holding its breath. The air felt heavy, unnatural, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. Every inch of the space felt charged, waiting for something terrible. His pulse quickened as he tried to steady his breath. He had to focus. He couldn't let the fear swallow him whole. But how could he focus when everything felt like it was bending around him? The floor seemed to shift beneath his feet, the walls faintly trembling, as if the building was alive, breathing in sync with the shadows. Every flicker of light, every fleeting sound, made him jump, his muscles taut and coiled, ready to spring into action. "Maya," he whispered again, a prayer, a command, but the word only hung in the air, unanswered. Eli stumbled backward, his mind racing. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, hadn't. It was suffocating. Each corner of the room seemed to be closing in on him, as if the very structure of the warehouse was contracting, the walls growing smaller by the second. And all the while, the shadows were gathering again. They hadn't left. They were waiting. He needed to think. He needed a plan. He couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. But before he could process anything, a sudden noise cut through the heavy silence. It was faint at first, a soft scrape, followed by a low, almost inaudible growl. It wasn't the sound of something alive. It was the sound of the darkness itself. The kind of noise that made the hairs on his neck stand at attention. Eli's hand shot out instinctively, reaching for anything, any tool or weapon he could use. But his fingers closed around nothing. The shadows seemed to steal the very light from his surroundings, making everything just out of reach. His heart pounded, a steady, terrifying rhythm that echoed in his ears. And then, the scraping sound grew louder, closer. The floor beneath him groaned as though it were cracking open. And for a split second, Eli thought he saw something small and glistening, move in the corner of his vision. It was gone before he could focus on it, but the unease in his chest deepened. His breath was shallow as he tried to listen, to make sense of the terrifying sound that now filled the room. The scraping, slow, deliberate, was followed by another sound, the soft tap of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Eli's pulse raced. Something was moving in the shadows, something huge. He spun around, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to shift and breathe, growing thicker with each passing second. And then, right in front of him, the air trembled. A figure stepped forward from the blackness, its outline only faintly visible against the dark. It was tall, towering over him, and it moved with a grace that was completely at odds with its size. The figure was draped in the very shadows that filled the room, its features hidden by the blackness, only its glowing eyes visible. Two piercing spots of cold light in the impenetrable darkness. The figure didn't speak at first. It just watched, its eyes never leaving Eli's face, as though studying him, waiting for something. Eli's throat tightened. His hand trembled at his side as he looked for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The door was still too far, and the shadows stretched between him and any hope of freedom. "What do you want from me?" he finally managed, his voice shaking, though he didn't want to show it. The fear gnawed at him from the inside, but he couldn't let it control him. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, the shadows swirling around it, thickening like smoke. And then, just when Eli thought he might break under the weight of its gaze, the figure spoke in a voice that was soft but full of dread. "You were not meant to be here." Its words were calm, measured, but there was a hidden weight to them, a threat under the surface. Eli's breath hitched, his mind racing. Not meant to be here. What did that even mean? Before he could process it, the shadows around the figure started to move again, undulating like they had a life of their own. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting in an instant. The darkness was suffocating now, closing in on him, wrapping around his limbs like chains. It was like the very walls were being drawn toward him, pulling him into the figure's orbit. "Why?" Eli forced out, desperation clawing at his throat. "What do you want from us? Why are you doing this?" The figure took a step forward, its presence oppressive, suffocating. "The choice is no longer yours." The voice was a whisper, too soft, too dangerous. "You were always meant to be a part of this. We all are." The shadows surged, a violent wave that slammed into Eli, pushing him back. His breath was knocked out of him, his vision blurring as the darkness seemed to take on a form of its own, surrounding him, crawling along his skin. "Please," Eli gasped, but his voice was swallowed by the dark. Then, a sharp sound, like cracking bone, echoed in the distance. His blood ran cold. The shadows parted for a brief moment, revealing a door that hadn't been there before. But before he could move toward it, the scraping sound returned, louder, sharper. It was coming back. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what was coming, but whatever this was, it was only going to get worse. And the worst part, the shadows had only just begun to close in. Eli's pulse thundered as his eyes locked on the door ahead, a faint glimmer of hope in a nightmare that felt endless. Its edges glowed faintly, an unnatural contrast to the oppressive darkness choking the room. But the scraping sound was growing louder, more erratic, as if whatever was making it was enraged by the possibility of his escape. The air itself seemed to thrum with hostility. The shadows, alive and angry, thickened around him, snaking up his legs. tightening with each step he tried to take toward the door. Every move was a battle, the force against him stronger with every inch he gained. It felt as though the darkness itself was trying to pull him down, to swallow him whole. Run, the voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, faint and distorted. Eli's head snapped up, his breath catching. It was Maya's voice. Or was it? Her tone was twisted, warped with static, like it wasn't entirely her. "Maya!" he shouted, his voice cracking, the sound bouncing uselessly off the oppressive walls. "Where are you?" No answer came, only that terrible scraping, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl, a sound so primal it sent chills down his spine. Whatever was in the darkness wasn't just watching anymore. It was moving closer, hunting. Eli lurched forward, dragging his body toward the door, but the shadows clawed at him like they had minds of their own. They weren't just darkness. They were something alive, something that wanted him. The faint glow of the door flickered, as though even it wasn't sure it could hold back the encroaching blackness. Behind him, the scraping stopped. Eli froze, every instinct screaming at him to keep moving, but he couldn't. His breath caught in his throat as he strained to listen. The silence was more terrifying than the sound. He could feel it. Something was there, just out of sight, watching him, waiting. A low, rasping exhale broke the stillness, and Eli's stomach twisted. Slowly, against every instinct telling him to run, he turned his head. The figure was there again, closer this time. Its outline rippled, a distortion of the shadows around it, as if it wasn't entirely real. The faint glow of its cold, empty eyes bore into him. It didn't move, but the oppressive force of its presence made Eli's knees buckle. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was different now, deeper, colder, with layers that seemed to echo within themselves. "You think you can escape?" Eli's throat tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Why are you doing this?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, the darkness around it began to shift, forming shapes, jagged, twisting forms that looked like claws reaching out toward him. They moved unnaturally, breaking apart and reforming as though they were testing him, playing with him. "You cannot leave," the figure finally said, the words heavy with finality. "You belong here now." "No," Eli growled, anger bubbling up in his chest despite the terror constricting his body. "You don't get to decide that." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused. The shadows surged again, wrapping around Eli's legs, pulling him backward with a force so strong it knocked him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the breath forced from his lungs as the cold tendrils of darkness crawled up his body, pinning him in place. The door, the only chance of escape, was still there, flickering weakly in the distance. But it was so far now, impossibly far, as though the room itself had stretched to keep him trapped. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, another sound emerged. A laugh. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distorted, until it filled the room. It wasn't human. It was layered, chaotic, a cacophony of voices overlapping and twisting together in a way that made Eli's skin crawl. "Eli," the voice came again, soft but unmistakable. "Maya." This time, it was clear, real, desperate. His head snapped toward the sound, his heart racing. "Maya, where are you?" He struggled against the shadows, his muscles straining, his body shaking with effort. But the more he fought, the tighter they held him. "Help me." Her voice was faint, distant, but it was enough to reignite the fire in him. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. With a guttural shout, Eli pushed against the darkness, clawing his way forward inch by inch. The shadows fought him, tearing at his skin, but he didn't stop. The door flickered again, the faint light pulsing as though it was reacting to his determination. "Don't fight it," the figure hissed, its voice sharp and cold. "You'll only make it worse." Eli ignored it, his teeth gritted as he forced his body to move. The scraping sound returned, louder now, closer. Whatever was coming for him was almost there, but he couldn't stop. Maya's voice was all he could hear, her plea echoing in his mind. And then, Just as he reached the edge of the shadows, something grabbed his ankle. It wasn't the darkness this time. It was solid, cold, and unyielding. Eli twisted, his eyes widening in horror as he looked down. A hand, pale and skeletal, with jagged black veins running through it, had emerged from the floor, its grip like iron around his leg. It pulled hard, dragging him back toward the center of the room. "No!" he shouted, his hands clawing at the floor, his fingers scraping against the cold concrete. The door was so close now, just out of reach, but the hand was too strong, its grip unrelenting. The figure laughed, a deep, resonating sound that made the entire room tremble. "You can't save her," it said, its tone dripping with malice. "You can't even save yourself." Eli's vision blurred, his strength fading as the shadows surged again, swallowing the light, the door, everything. And then, just before the darkness overtook him completely, he heard Maya's voice one last time. "Don't give up, Eli. Please don't let them win." Her words hung in the air, a lifeline in the abyss. But as the blackness closed in, Eli could only wonder, was it already too late? The darkness smothered Eli, pressing against his skin like a wet, suffocating shroud. His body trembled as he clawed at the concrete, each scrape of his fingers against the ground sending jagged pain shooting up his arms. The skeletal hand around his ankle was ice cold, its jagged black veins pulsing faintly, as though alive. It pulled harder, dragging him inch by inch into the writhing void at the center of the room. The glowing door flickered weakly, its light struggling to pierce through the consuming shadows. It was still there, but it seemed farther now, almost unreachable. Eli gritted his teeth, his mind screaming at him to fight, to keep moving, even as his limbs felt like lead. "Maya," he cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm coming. Just hold on." But the moment the words left his lips, the figure in the shadows let out a low, guttural chuckle that echoed like a death knell. Its glowing eyes burned brighter, and it began to move toward him, its distorted silhouette gliding across the floor as though it were part of the darkness itself. The air grew colder with every step it took, and the growling, scraping noise in the background intensified, reverberating through the walls. "She's not yours to save," the figure hissed, its voice layered with malice and something else, something ancient and unknowable. "You were warned. You shouldn't have come." Eli's heart hammered in his chest, his breath ragged. "She's my sister," he shouted, his voice raw. "I won't leave her here." The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly as if considering his words. For a moment, the room fell into an eerie silence, the tension unbearable. Then, without warning, the skeletal hand tightened its grip on Eli's ankle, the veins spreading like black lightning across his skin. He screamed as a searing cold shot through his leg, paralyzing him momentarily. From the darkness, the laughter returned, deep, layered, and mocking. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding him. Eli felt the vibrations in his chest, the sound digging into his mind like claws. "You think you can defy us?" the figure whispered, its voice a venomous hiss. "This place isn't just shadows. It's hunger, and it will take everything you love." "No," Eli roared, his muscles burning as he yanked his leg with all his strength. The skeletal hand faltered for a moment, loosening just enough for him to twist free. He scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving as he stumbled toward the glowing door. But the shadows weren't done with him. They surged forward like a living tide, a mass of writhing tendrils that lashed out, striking at his legs and arms. One wrapped around his wrist, pulling him back. Another coiled around his neck, choking the air from his lungs. The door's light flickered violently, as though it was on the verge of being extinguished. Eli's vision blurred, and he felt the strength draining from his body. He was losing. The figure was right. The darkness wasn't just alive. It was consuming him, feeding on his fear, his desperation. And then, through the suffocating blackness, he heard it again. Maya's voice, faint but clear, like a beacon cutting through the storm. "Eli, don't stop. It's a trick. Keep moving." Her voice snapped him back to reality, and with a sudden surge of adrenaline, He tore the tendrils from his neck, ignoring the searing pain. He staggered forward, his eyes locked on the door. It was his only chance. If he could just reach it, maybe, just maybe, he could save them both. Behind him, the figure snarled, its calm composure replaced by a primal fury. The shadows surged again, more violently this time, crashing over him like a wave. The air grew heavier, colder, and Eli felt his body faltering under the weight of it all. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. "Maya!" he shouted again, his voice hoarse. "I'm almost there. Just hold on." The door flickered brighter as he drew closer, its glow fighting against the encroaching dark. But as he reached out, his fingers mere inches from the light, the figure screamed, a sound so unearthly it made Eli's entire body seize. The shadows erupted, forming a massive wall between him and the door. The glow dimmed, and for a moment, Eli thought all was lost. But then, through the chaos, something changed. A faint shimmer appeared in the air next to him, rippling like heat waves. And in the midst of it, he saw her, Maya. She was standing there, her face pale but determined, her eyes locked on his. "Eli, trust me," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You have to keep going. Don't let it win." "But how?" Eli stammered, his mind reeling. She looked real, but everything about this place screamed deception. Could he trust what he was seeing? Could this be another trick? The figure hissed, its glowing eyes narrowing as it stepped closer, its voice dripping with venom. "She's not real, Eli. She's nothing but a shadow, like the rest of them." Maya's form flickered, and for a moment, doubt clawed at him. But then she stepped forward, her hand reaching for his. "Please, Eli, you have to trust me." Eli's heart pounded as he glanced between her and the figure. The shadows pressed closer, the door's light fading fast. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. The room twisted and warped around Eli, the darkness thickening like a living fog. The door, once so vivid and glowing, was now barely visible, a faint shimmer struggling against the suffocating shadows. Maya's outstretched hand trembled slightly, her face flickering like a candle in the wind. The figure behind him, the embodiment of everything cold and relentless, loomed closer, its voice seeping into his mind like poison. "She's lying to you," the figure hissed, its tone sharp and commanding. "You don't belong here. She does. Don't you see? This is all her fault." Eli's mind swirled, doubt clawing at his resolve. The weight of exhaustion, fear, and the unrelenting pull of the shadows bore down on him. The figure's words cut deep, not because he believed them, but because they played on his worst fears. What if Maya was the reason they were here? What if this place wanted her more than it wanted him? "No!" he shouted, shaking his head as if to physically dispel the thought. "I'm not leaving without her. You hear me? I'm not leaving." Maya's hand remained steady, her eyes locked on his with fierce determination. "You don't have to listen to it, Eli. You know the truth. You always have." The figure let out a guttural laugh, the sound reverberating like a seismic wave. The shadows around it thickened, coalescing into grotesque shapes that writhed and twisted in unnatural ways. Faces, half-formed and hollow-eyed, emerged from the darkness, their mouths opening in silent screams before melting back into the void. "You think you're the hero here," the figure said, its voice layered with mockery and something far more sinister. "But heroes don't survive this place. You think you can fight me. You can't even trust what you're seeing." Eli gritted his teeth, his fists clenching so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. "I don't care what you are," he spat. "I'm getting to her, and I'm getting us out of here." The figure stepped forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Its form was no longer just a shadow. It was solidifying, taking on a shape that was somehow worse than its formlessness. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in jagged points. Its head was featureless except for those burning, empty eyes that bore into Eli like twin black holes. Maya's voice cut through the tension, sharp and urgent. "Eli, listen to me. You have to move now. It's feeding on your hesitation." Her words jolted him into action. He lunged forward, his hand reaching for hers. But just as their fingers were about to touch, the figure roared, and the entire room convulsed. The floor beneath him cracked and split open, revealing a swirling chasm of darkness below. Tendrils shot up from the abyss, writhing and lashing out like serpents. One wrapped around his wrist, yanking him back. Another coiled around his torso, squeezing the air from his lungs. The light of the door dimmed further, and Eli's vision blurred as the shadows constricted tighter and tighter. "Eli!" Maya screamed, her voice breaking with panic. She lunged toward him, her hand brushing his for the briefest of moments before the shadows surged between them, forming an impenetrable barrier. Her image flickered violently, as if she were being pulled away, fading into the void. "Don't let it win. You're stronger than this." Eli's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, but the strength was draining from his body. The figure's laughter echoed around him, louder and more distorted, as if it were feeding on his despair. "You've already lost," it whispered, its voice soft but deafening in his ears. "You're just too stubborn to see it." Through the haze of pain and fear, Eli's eyes locked onto the faint shimmer of the door. It was still there, barely, its light flickering like the last ember of a dying fire. He couldn't give up, not now, not when he was so close. He had to trust himself. He had to trust Maya. With a roar of defiance, he twisted his body, pulling against the tendrils with every ounce of strength he had left. The pain was excruciating, the shadows tearing at his skin like razor blades. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The barrier separating him from Maya began to crack, the shadows splintering as if reacting to his determination. For a fleeting moment, he saw her again, her face pale but resolute, her hand reaching through the darkness. "You can do this," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "You've always been stronger than you think." Eli's hand shot out, his fingers brushing hers once more. The shadows screamed in protest, the figure surging toward them like a storm. The ground beneath him began to crumble, the chasm widening, threatening to swallow him whole. And then, just as their hands finally locked together, the door's light flared violently, filling the room with a blinding brilliance. But the shadows didn't retreat. They surged forward in one final, furious wave, engulfing everything in their path. The figure's roar echoed through the blinding light, its form distorting and twisting as it was dragged toward the chasm. Eli held onto Maya with everything he had, the world around them collapsing into chaos. The light, the shadows, the figure, they all swirled together in a cacophony of sound and motion until there was nothing left but the overwhelming sensation of falling. And then silence. Eli opened his eyes, his heart pounding. The room was gone. The door was gone. Everything was gone. All that remained was the darkness, and Maya's hand still clutching his. Eli's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as he tried to make sense of the stillness. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a soft, warm glow that seemed to radiate from nowhere and everywhere at once. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the light. Slowly, he realized they were standing on solid ground, though it felt strangely weightless beneath his feet. Maya was beside him, her face illuminated by the warm light. She looked unharmed, though her expression was filled with cautious relief. "Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You did it. You brought us back." Eli looked around, his heart still racing. The endless void they had been trapped in was gone, replaced by an open expanse of sky and stars that stretched infinitely in all directions. He felt a strange calm wash over him, as though the space itself was reassuring them. "But where are we?" Eli asked, his voice hoarse. "This isn't home." Maya glanced at him, her grip on his hand tightening. "It's not, but it's safe," she said softly. "We're no longer in that place. The shadows can't reach us here." She turned to face him fully, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You saved me, Eli. You never gave up on me." He swallowed hard, the weight of what they had been through settling on his shoulders. "You would have done the same for me," he said, his voice cracking. "We're a team, Maya. Always." As if in response to their bond, the glowing expanse around them began to shift, Shapes formed in the distance: trees, mountains, a clear blue sky. And before long, they found themselves standing in a serene meadow bathed in golden sunlight. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the sound of birdsong filled the air. Eli looked at Maya, his heart lifting for the first time since their ordeal began. "This feels real," he said, a faint smile breaking across his face. Maya nodded, her own smile blooming. "Maybe it's more than real," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Maybe it's a second chance." They stood together, watching as the world around them came to life. The darkness and terror they had faced seemed like a distant memory now, a nightmare they had escaped by sheer determination and love. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eli felt hope, pure, untainted hope, as they began to walk through the meadow, the warmth of the sunlight on their skin. Eli turned to Maya and chuckled softly. "You know, after all that, I think we deserve some quiet time." She laughed, the sound light and free. "Definitely," she agreed. "No more creepy shadows. Just peace." Eli grinned, his hand still clasping hers. "I don't care where we are, as long as we're together." And together, they walked into the light of their new beginning. Thank you for reading The Silent Watcher. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping, suspenseful tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more. Stay tuned for more adventures, mysteries, and unforgettable moments. See you in the next story.